In July 1940, a paperback book entitled Guilty Men was published and quickly sold out, despite bookstore chains such as W.H. Smith refusing to handle it. The book was authored anonymously by a journalist, Michael Foot, and two MPs, Frank Owen and Peter Howard, using the collective pseudonym Cato. Guilty Men is an emotional retrospective condemnation of British foreign policy, appeasement, and inadequate preparation for war, which led to the Armageddon of World War II in general and the evacuation from Dunkirk in particular. In the post-war decades, historians began taking a more balanced and comprehensive view of the entire first half of the 20th century. A failure of foreign policy led to unprecedented slaughter in the trenches, and a determination by the political generation of Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain that this must never be allowed to happen again. No one, not even Winston Churchill, foresaw that an even greater evil than military conflict would be spawned in the minds of right-wing dictators, empowered by comparatively primitive analog technology. Since the early 1980s, there has been a slow, insidious drift to the political right in the United Kingdom. A more efficient proto-Orwellian police state is emerging, in which the quasi-independent but antiquated judiciary is easily marginalised and will eventually be rendered redundant. Cabinet secretaries accrue to themselves the discretionary power to legislate without parliamentary scrutiny and to authorise law-breaking by undercover police as the instrument of an inquisitorial Home Office star chamber. Vigilantes wear fluorescent green or orange vests rather than brown or black shirts, though picket critics of government in the well-established fascist tradition and like undercover police officers enjoy public interest immunity from prosecution under English law in the fascist tradition. Homes are targeted using intrusive infrasound and digital video surveillance technologies, which were not available to previous analog fascist governments. Journalists, whistleblowers, and solicitors are reluctant to criticise or scrutinise the security lobby for fear of becoming surveillance targets themselves. Unlike the cause célèbre trials of the Thatcher era brought under the Official Secrets Act, juries and judges now face the implied threat of police surveillance in their homes and into their lives if they fail to deliver verdicts and sentences favourable to the government. There is a growing intolerance of radical opinion, eccentricity, and mental illness. Official policy is to demonise and discredit critical social media. German-style denunciation is widespread. The state has created a new industry for the digital era, with mass employment of human intelligence sources on the construction of networked information superhighways. A database can be compiled of guilty men and women for the late 20th century onwards, whose role in establishing the proto-Orwellian police state and presiding over its human rights abuses can be studied by future historians, if such studies are permitted. A roll call would probably have to begin with Margaret Thatcher, followed by the last Conservative Home Secretary of the 20th century and creature of the night, Michael Howard. New Labour would contribute Blair, Straw, Blunkett, Reid, Goldsmith, Brown and Jackie Smith. The 2010 coalition candidates would include Cameron, May and Clegg. The leading bad actors, post-May 2015, would continue to be Cameron and Theresa May, who presides over the Home Office as if it were a Reich ministry. Is nudge indicative of a modern conservative fascism? And can a historic line be drawn from Stanley Baldwin, who opposed the rise of the European dictators, but was judged guilty of not doing enough, to David Cameron, who is the current leader of a proto-Orwellian police state with ambition to further dismantle the inconvenient framework of civil liberties which previous generations fought and died to preserve? Can similar lines be traced from the conservative admirers of fascism in the 1930s to the current Home Office ministers who are working to roll back history with secret trials which conceal evidence of official criminality, proceedings which would have impressed the early fascist leaders? The appeal of fascism for many is the vision of a utopia with full employment and efficient social infrastructure. Suppressing the contrary views of critics and the actions of whistleblowers would seem a small price to pay. Insufficient numbers of voters in the United Kingdom are expressing concern about the future consequences of a civil liberties dissolution, nor what is in the minds of political leaders empowered by digital technology. Civil liberties in the United Kingdom survived the existential threats from fascism and communism, but now seem critically endangered by the insidious political economy of the surveillance state. This apathy is not without precedent, but the levels of economic prosperity currently enjoyed by subjects and citizens of the Western nations are on a scale unparalleled in human history. Prosperity has come from governments redistributing the wealth generated by new technologies and borrowing from the trade surpluses of the emerging sweatshop economies. Whether or not this is sustainable is a moot point. Voters are more concerned with protecting the source of their income than what are, for the vast majority, just abstract notions of freedom. "It's the economy, stupid," is a hackneyed expression from the Clinton era of the 1990s, which has never been more apposite. Despite the war in Iraq and Tony Blair's sins against Parliament, the Labour Party won the 2005 general election with a healthy majority because of the credit bubble boom. The economy crashed in 2008, and so Labour lost their majority in the election of 2010. As part of his last budget before becoming Prime Minister in 2007, Chancellor Gordon Brown increased income tax from 10% to 20% for the lowest paid workers, which led to a backbench revolt among Labour MPs who'd obsequiously obeyed the illiberal commandments of the Messiah, Tony Blair, for a decade. In 2015, just months after a Conservative general election victory, the appointed peers in the House of Lords broke with convention and voted against a government finance bill masquerading as a statutory instrument for the first time since the constitutional crisis of 1911. The bill planned to abolish a system of tax credits which would disproportionately affect low-income workers, thus inspiring a revolt of patricians and opportunists in the Lords, which was quite unlike any reaction to the dissolution of civil liberties in recent years. There is an old adage that people get the governments they deserve, which reassures simplistic mindsets who look at corrupt regimes and take for granted their own good fortune to live, by chance, in a quasi-liberal democracy, as if this lucky accident were a testament to the virtue of themselves and their countrymen. In a pluralist democracy, activists usually have the freedom to campaign. In authoritarian regimes, protesters and campaigners are likely to be harassed, imprisoned, or even executed for their activities. Britain is currently transitioning from a liberal democracy, regulated by accessible statutes, to an authoritarian democracy, governed by the secretive arbitrary will of a ministerial cabal and its appointed commissioners. This government uses technological advances over its predecessors to break statute and common law without hindrance from independent judicial oversight or public scrutiny, always thought necessary in the past to prevent official corruption. Does the incumbent government possess unprecedented virtue to use its godlike powers wisely, or is it concealing a Nixonian litany of criminal acts for future historians to uncover? The guilty men and women of the digital revolution are therefore not just the politicians who accept the patronage of party leaders and neglect the interests of their constituents. Voters, for whom economic self-interest is the first commandment or categorical imperative of capitalism, may find that political apathy and financial self-interest come with an added price: the disadvantageous loss of economic liberalism and its associated liberal system of laws. Without these laws, which make liberal democracy the worst system of government, except for all the others, the commercial environment may become less conducive to those engaged in the Darwinian struggle to accrue personal wealth. Without these laws, we may even become the aggressor in dubious foreign policy adventures and disastrous military campaigns abroad.